Alfred Wong, the Vice President of Investments here at Origin. It's almost 4 o'clock, and I'm sure many of you are jet-lagged, like I am. So I have thought about changing my presentation a little bit. I actually spent a considerable amount of time figuring out what insight I can actually give you guys. Because if we sort of think about the cannabis days, where many of the what we call the Wild Wild West days of cannabis, where there were a lot of companies out hyping up what they were doing, a lot of companies talking about how great their technology was, the amount of revenue that they're going to generate. We sort of see that now in the infancy of the psychedelic space. And so when I was thinking about from Origin's perspective, what information can we give you guys that would make this trip worthwhile? It certainly was a challenge. And if you've been to the early session this morning, we heard from many prominent venture capitalists, many of whom were much more involved in this space than the Origin was. And there was really interesting topics that was discussed about the regulatory perspectives of how psychedelics was going to change, some of the legal areas as well. And so when I thought about what Origin and what I was going to talk about, we're at the end of the session today, but I thought about, well, what about the operators and the investors in this space? It's great that we talk about vision and we talk about what the long-term opportunities are in the space, but if you're operating a business, what can you take away from this conference that would actually be impactful and actionable for you guys? And so a bit about my background and why I think it's relevant my background has in this conversation is that I've been through this entire landscape of this business journey, you can call it. I started in investment banking 12 years ago, working for a French investment bank on the equity research desk. And that journey morphed into a journey of entrepreneurship. And I worked in many startup capacities, all the way from a startup all the way to having the company publicly listed on one of the Canadian stock exchanges. So I've been a former public company CEO and also now angel investor, impact investor on a variety of different aspects. In addition to Origin, I'm also Chief Operations Officer on a healthcare tech startup that we provide software for over 800 family doctors and specialists. So I was thinking that this experience, perhaps I could give you some interesting insights into how I see psychedelics and how you guys as operators and investors could look into this space. Now, I'm going to have some filler material here just to sort of demonstrate where Origin is in this space, in this discussion. But there's really going to be 3 takeaways that I want there to be. First is that I want you guys to know why psychedelic stocks have tanked in the last 12 months. And the second is to plant a seed in the minds of business operators and investors, what questions you should be asking when you think about your business. And then the third and final outcome that I want, which is more of a personal one, is that if you guys are still awake at the end of this presentation, then that's a win for me. So Origin, we are what we call an actively managed investment issuer. It's sort of an exploratory phase right now because we're in an interesting subset of venture capitalism where we deploy capital to invest into psychedelic companies, but we're not really a venture capitalist because we don't charge management fees or performance fees. We're not an ETF because we're actively managed. We're also not a mutual fund because we don't charge fees. So we're in this really complex gray area of regulatory, and we've been working with the Canadian government, with the Canadian Securities Commission over the last 6 months to figure out if we can kind of take our vehicle and be able to allow retail investors to get access to venture capital. And so this graphic just really quickly demonstrate where Origin resides. One of the key challenges that we found was that retail investors often don't have access to early stage capital, right? Because they're not accredited investors and often it's really high risk capital. But what if there was an opportunity where retail investors could leverage the knowledge of a venture capital fund and be able to invest alongside with them? And so that's where Origin existed. I'm not really going to get into the whole history because I'm really preaching to the choir about where psychedelics have been in this entire journey. But I really wanted to point out two things. basically, this whole psychedelic movement from a capital markets perspective started really in the last, 24 months, right? With the big names like Compass Pathways, Field Trip Health, Cybin, MindMed, and all these guys that are generating a lot of interest and activity in the capital markets. But as you all know, the last 12 months, everything has tanked, right? 50 to 60% off from the highs. So from Origin's perspective, we see there are really 4 key sectors within the psychedelic space. Depending on who you talk to, there might be 1 or 2 more different categories here, but I think it's really important to sort of put a little bit of framework around it. There is a lot of uncertainty on the types of business models out there, but in general, we sort of classify it into, for example, wellness retreats, where there are business models where they partner with local resorts, local hotels, and they have a 1 week or 14-day session where they take participants along this journey to improve their mental health. There's psychedelic assisted therapy, ketamine clinics, for example, where they have essentially that same therapeutic session, but really on a more clinical basis and on a more long-term basis. Then there's the typical biotech plays where they're doing early stage discovery. The value where the return on investment is probably on a much more longer horizon, given the difficulty and the investment required to take drugs through clinical trials. And then we have ancillary businesses, which we sort of characterize as the picks and shovels of this industry. So I'll just sort of give the quick plug into Origin's portfolio companies in each of these spaces, and then I'll get into more relevant discussion about where we are in terms of the psychedelic capital markets. So one of the companies that we invested in is a company called Dimensions Health Centers. They're essentially aiming to be a 5-star wellness resort provider, led by Christopher Dawson, who was the founder and CEO of one of Canada's largest mental health inpatient and outpatient clinic network. And really the intent here was to be able to provide a luxurious environment in which to do mental therapy sessions. As I outlined earlier, one of the many business companies that I've seen cross our desks is companies that like to be less capital intensive by partnering with local resorts like Fairmonts, Radissons, in luxurious tourist destinations, and be able to provide therapy sessions. What Dimensions thought differently was that the experience is not really the same. So if you imagine yourself in going through call it a wellness retreat session at a luxury resort, and you're going through this program, and just next to you is a family with crying kids, like that's not really going to help your mental therapy session, right? So Dimensions is really aiming to be a property developer where they build the resort from the ground up. Every single cabin that they have is designed to be in line with the mental therapy sessions led by Dr. Cook, their chief medical officer. So this property is a 16-hectare property, 2 hours north of Toronto in Canada. It's their flagship Maple Lake property. Each cabin is about 450 square feet. So you can see from the design, it's very Canadian, it's very wilderness, but it's really designed in a way where it encompasses not only the therapy session, the clinical approaches that the local clinicians would have, but it's really the whole environment that you have to be able to cultivate that wellness. In terms of psychedelic assisted therapy, we invest in a company called Tripsitter Clinics. They are a Texas-based company where they are delivering ketamine-based therapy through telehealth. They're in over 23 states. One of the interesting parts of what they do is to be able to leverage some of their internal IT infrastructure to be able to very quickly deliver ketamine to many patients across the states, and to be able to very effectively deliver that care through their built-in telehealth platform. We have 2 investments in Biotechnology, Xperia and Ocean Bio. They're both in stealth right now, but one of the interesting aspects is that some of the technologies and sciences that we have heard of today they're being deployed widely across this sector, and there's more information that we'll be providing on Ocean Bio and Xpera. So if you guys have any interest in these, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter on our website, originpsychedelics.com. And in silly businesses, I love to talk about this because we invested into Microdose, which is the company behind Plant Medicine Week. It's an amazing job so far, Connor and Patrick. And what we liked about Microdose, and again, this sort of goes into a little bit of a different direction because it's not really the typical psychedelic business that we think about. But from our perspective, it wasn't really just investing into psychedelics, it was investing into this whole movement. And when we spoke with Patrick and Connor, and we sort of outlined the opportunities that this made us available to, was not only access to deal flow, which is a great thing, but really think about where psychedelics is going to be in the next 5 to 10 years. And if we've observed from the cannabis space, it's really important to have these events where we're trying to bridge the knowledge gap, right, from different subsectors, different industries, and try to create this understanding on how we best move forward. So Plant Medicine Week is really a great example of people that we bring from North America to Europe and other parts of the world to come together and figure out, well, how do we best move forward? Because right now, the industry itself is really small. And I think what we've heard from many speakers today and yesterday is what the opportunity is to become in the long term. So now getting to the more interesting parts of this discussion, now that I've had my plug, we look at the types of investment that have been made. Most of the investments that have been made in the capital market space is really on companies that are doing biotechnology, right? Because at the end of the day, pharmaceuticals is going to be one of the main components of opportunity and revenue in the psychedelic space. And so in 2018, 2019, really before this whole psychedelic hype movement sort of came to be, there was only a meager $60 million invested into the psychedelic space. And by 2020, that has increased by tenfold. By the end of 2021, we see, and this is according to LEK Insights, is that it was going to hit $2.1 billion. What's really interesting about this number is that the interest from capital markets or interest from funds to deploy capital into this space demonstrates how companies are seeing the potential opportunities of psychedelics. And in the next slide, I'm going to skip over to this slide, and that's in contrast to how we see some of the stock prices of these publicly listed companies, how they have performed in the last 12 months. The Horizons ETF fund, MindMed, Compass Pathways, they've all been, they've all tanked to 50 to 60% from the highs. And the question is, well, why is that? We have a lot of investment flowing into biotechnology, but why are the stock prices of these companies doing so poorly? And I don't profess to be knowledgeable as much as some of the early speakers today, but Origin, we really see three reasons why psychedelic stocks have performed the way they have. And there's a bit of it which would sort of have some implication for you as you think about how you operate your business and get venture capital funding. So one of the main reasons we feel is that there really is a lack of major headlines. If you recall in the map that I had, psychedelics had a really, really long history, and it was really in the last 24 months that we had all these, hyped companies and, really interesting news releases. But really, there hasn't really been that many really positive results coming from clinical trials, right? So there's really been a lack of really high-level major headlines, and that sort of caused a bit of a lull, right? Many investors early on felt that they were, really excited about Atai, MindMed, Cybin, and when the news releases didn't really come through, people lost interest, and it sort of leads into the slow path of commercialization too, because a lot of these biotechnology companies, as you recognize, take a long time to take the drugs through clinical trials for safety, efficacy, and so that leads into this whole sort of a path where there really isn't that much news in the space. And that leads to my third point, which is really we're in this new normal in terms of capital markets where a lot of inflows are driven by retail shareholders where they want instant gratification. They're looking at the latest meme stocks on Wall Street Bets, and they're figuring out, okay, well, what's the next big craze? And at one point, psychedelics was, right? But then there was no more news to support that, and so very quickly, interest has turned away from psychedelics. Now, this might seem very bad in the scope of what we're discussing today, but I actually think it's a really good opportunity. And really, the interesting opportunity is that it not only separates out the cream of the crop of businesses, but it also gives time for us as industry to really reflect on what it is critical for us to move forward as a movement in order to create a sustainable future for us. Sustainable future in terms of sustainable business, sustainable revenue. Because if you think about what the alternative was, if the stock market continued to went up and we had MindMed, Compass kind of go up day after day, month after month, we would all be patting ourselves on the back and saying what a great job we're doing. But now we recognize that there's actually a lot of value that we need to backfill in order to justify the valuation that we gave these companies in the first place. And so when we think about how we need to look forward in terms of improving the way that we do business, is on a couple of things. So at Origin, we see that there's four indicators of long-term growth. One of them is new subsectors, and they're not really new in a sense. We've seen companies with nootropics, nutraceuticals that are selling products that are they're selling them as psychedelic gummy bears and whatnot, but they're not really psychedelic based because they're all legal. What's really interesting about that in terms of this whole movement is that they're normalizing psychedelics in the consumer market. These companies where they're selling gummy bears, they're selling different products, they're creating this brand awareness that psychedelics within the scope of consumer goods is normal. And that's going to have a really profound impact on psychedelic companies going forward, where when they're ready after 5, 7 to 10 years of drug development, that they're going to be entering into a market where psychedelics is going to be much more acceptable. The second regulatory changes, like we sort of talked that to the bone in various sessions today, so I won't really get into that. The third is joint partnerships across subsectors, and Abraham, who spoke before me, outlined that his organization was working with MindMed. That's absolutely critical in how we sort of see success in the future. Many of the companies that we are working with now, we all need to work together and find different ways to increase partnerships so that we can create a lot more value together. And finally, evolving goals and strategies. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this, and I'm going to shift over to this one right here. And apologies for the text there. But there's a really interesting conversation that I was having, and one of the interesting conversations that I've had with venture capital companies who are looking at investing into psychedelic companies, and then contrasting that conversation with business operators that approach me for capital, is the question is, well, what is the revenue potential? When we talk about the long-term value of psychedelics, right? Some of us say that it's worth $100 billion, right, in 10, 20 years. Some of us say it's $1 billion. And we spend a lot of time talking about vision, but we don't spend enough time talking about how do we actually generate revenue for the company. And so these conversations end up not happening for many reasons. And even in some cases, a lot of public companies don't really have a straight answer for that. So I think it's really important that companies, for you operators and investors, to really think about how is it that you can drive revenue in the short term, because there are significant impact that you can have on not only the valuation of your company, but on the sustainability of your company. And you might,
I know there's going to be many people who disagree with me on this because sometimes you want to focus on what you do best and focus on the revenue 10 years down the road. But in all honesty, if you don't have enough revenue, if you don't have enough cash, you're not going to survive 10 years, right? So one of the things that we loved about Microdose was that they had a business model that was generating revenue, and they can use that revenue to grow. And with that, that sort of lesson really needs to contrast to what some of the work that you guys are doing. Nutraceuticals, for example, they're generating revenue when they're not really selling a psychedelic product yet, right? They're selling the concept that it is psychedelic-based hallucinogenics and nootropics, and it'll be great for your mental health, but they're building a brand, they're building revenue. So if you think about 3 years, 4 years, 5 years down the road, those companies are going to be in a really good position to launch their psychedelic products off the backs of the work that you guys are doing on the science side. So I think it's really important that these partnerships from biotech companies have with these more consumer brand products in order to ensure that there is that longevity and revenue sustainability as you go forward. And then it's covered here, but one point I wanted to make was looking at the hard statistical endpoints. And that's really important because many conversations that I have with pharmaceutical biotech companies is that they have a grand vision of wanting to solve depression or some other endpoint, or PTSD, for example. And when I asked about, okay, well, how are they actually going to verify that their drug or the NCE is going to actually do the job? Well, their answer is that, oh, we'll do a survey. We'll do a post-treatment survey and ask them how they feel. The problem with that is that it's really hard to define the value. So companies like Clairvoyant, for example, where they're having really hard statistical endpoints and they can actually really figure out what is it that they're measuring and measure it really well, means that they're not going to be wasting money doing all these different clinical trials and end up really not delivering any value because they can't have any IP patent protection on it. So these are really key things that I think really drive how companies really think about how they work going into this new normal. Like I mentioned, the new normal is really figuring out how retail shareholders invest. And how do you, as business operators and investors, ask questions on your business model to adapt to that new normal. I think it's really critical that you think about partnerships where you can collectively create value, not just in the sense of business value, but how do you create revenue sustainability? I don't have all the right answers for that, and oftentimes it's really conferences like these where we collectively talk about these important topics before we really figure out if there is a model that we can approach in the near term to create that value. And finally, I just want to do a shout out to Microdose for launching the Scicap deal board. From the perspective of business operators who are looking at tapping into venture capital, it's often a challenge figuring out how to approach investors, how to construct your presentation, how do you articulate your business model to be separate from all the 100 other companies out there. So Microdose, they launched Scicap Deal Board, which is really a way to start moving that needle forward, to make sure that companies have not only the access, but the platform to be able to deliver their company towards investors who are hungry to invest in the space. As I mentioned, $2.1 billion is investing into this space by 2021, and half of that being in the pharmaceutical side. So MedPlant Science, I think Angus Taylor is here. Do reach out to him. They're doing some amazing stuff there. So that's all I had really for these key takeaways. These 4 key takeaways I did when I wanted to create this really boring presentation for you guys, but really I just wanted you guys to understand why psychedelic stocks have tanked in the last 12 months, and just really to plant a seed into your mind on what questions you should be asking yourself on your business model and what ways that you can create revenue sustainability, because that plays directly into the sustainability of your company as you approach new financing opportunities.